without further ado, let me welcome our guests today. Jeffrey Sachs is an American economist and public policy analyst who is a professor at Columbia University. Dr. Joanna Lei is a Taiwanese scholar, former lawmaker, and public commentator. She has written and spoken widely on Taiwan's politics, U.S.-China-Taiwan relations, and issues of sovereignty and security. Dr. Lei and Professor Sachs, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you so much. And great to be together with Joanna. I'm very excited.
Professor Sachs, if we could start with you, the U.S. has consistently resisted the emergence of a peaceful multilateral world. And figures like Elbridge Colby, Secretary of Pete Hegseth, has been constantly discussing war as a way to preserve U.S. primacy. How dangerous is the situation in Asia Pacific in particular? And do you see Taiwan being sacrificed for Washington's strategic interests?
One thing to say right at the outset is that there is apparently a debate going on inside the U.S. security state about the U.S. military and security doctrines. And so we're going to learn something in the coming days and weeks, more than we know now. There are lots of reports about a new national defense strategy to be unveiled. Some reports say that it calls for a retrenchment of American strategy. That would be interesting. That is actually necessary from the U.S. point of view. The U.S. is an overstretched and not very capable global empire. It has military bases in an estimated 80 countries. There's no definitive list. Something around 750 to 800 overseas military bases. Again, the numbers are somewhat vague, and so you hear different estimates. But this is an overstretched empire, and as in past overstretched empires, one evidence of that is the hemorrhaging of the budget. The United States runs very large budget deficits. It racks up debt rapidly. The United States has just entered a shutdown of government. This could last hours or days or even weeks, but it reflects the fact that the budget and fiscal policy is in disarray in the United States, and that is a reflection of the overstretched nature of the American empire. Now, having said all of that, we therefore don't really know or understand what this rather erratic Trump government is doing. The foreign policy of the United States is partly determined by the deep state. I would just say deep state means military-industrial complex, which is a set of institutions, including the Pentagon, the CIA, the other intelligence agencies, parts of the U.S. Congress, notably the Armed Services Committees, the military contractors, these days Silicon Valley, very much part of that. And there's a certain continuity of the military-industrial complex, but there's also a lot of instability now in American politics in general. With Trump, we have an extremely erratic leader, not very intelligent, not knowledgeable about history, very impulsive, not very strategic, and with very strong views, but strong and sometimes labile views, meaning that they're strong, but they often change as well, depending on who has spoken to the president. This adds another layer of unpredictability. So to come back to your question, we don't really know. I'd say watching, even very close observers, what U.S. policy is right now. There's nothing clearly articulated. But when it comes to Taiwan, the risk, of course, is that the United States enters into an open conflict with China, I would say in a way that's analogous to the war in Ukraine, which is a very clear and vivid example of U.S. imperial arrogance and overstretch. Ukraine is a battleground because the United States aimed to surround Russia with the military bases and weapon systems through the enlargement of the U.S. NATO military alliance. And Russia, already more than 30 years ago, said, don't do that. That's a red line for us. The United States does not hear red lines traditionally. One of the main points about this arrogant and stumbling U.S. empire is that it takes pride in not acknowledging or recognizing any other country's red lines, even up to and including nuclear superpowers. And it's gotten worse and worse at listening to other countries' red lines over time. There was a certain deadly prudence in the 1950s and 1960s, the mutually assured destruction doctrine. The idea that we were on the knife edge of nuclear war was appreciated and understood to some extent. Now that's brushed aside. And for the last 25 years, especially after the end of the Soviet Union, the United States said, well, we're on our own. We can do what we want. When it comes to Taiwan, that could mean U.S. arming Taiwan over the vociferous objections of the People's Republic of China. It could mean all the things that Dr. Lay knows more than anyone else in the whole world about. So I won't say more, but it could mean making provocations that could lead to an open war with China. God help us if that happens. It would be terrible, extraordinarily dangerous, horrible for the United States, by the way, because I don't think the U.S. Would have much military success thousands of miles away from its border. But there's nothing in America's history over the last 50 years or so that gives you much confidence of the quality of judgment of American leadership.
Dr. Lay, if you could respond to Professor Sachs, but also add a little bit about how does it look from Taiwan's perspective and different political forces within Taiwan when the United States talks about war rhetoric and hysteria with the mainland?
Certainly, Taiwan is under DPP rule at this time. So the stated position by both the President Lai Ching-te as well as other party cadres are pretty much bifurcation. Once on the one side, they would push for Taiwan independent agenda, which means independent from PRC, so moving away from mainland, hopefully with the backstop of Japan and the United States. On the other hand, they are moving extremely to the total dependency of the United States in economic and technological advancement. The best example there is TSMC. So you can see that Taiwan is actually moving in two directions, moving closer to the United States economically and depending on its military support to the United States, and at the same time use that as a posture to move away from the mainland government, PRC. So with that being in the red line or the core interest of the People's Republic of China, then there is a potential of conflict. Here we're looking at the government paying little attention to the potential of conflict, relying on pretty much the U.S. guarantee or U.S. rhetoric. But at the same time, in terms of economic and trade relations, we're still extremely closely tied to PRC. So with the society at large, you have a very loud voice stated by the DPP government, and you have a lot of quiet, silent objections by all the opposition party and people who do not claim to have any party affiliation. That's one. The second one is, if we look carefully, Jeff mentioned about similarity to the Ukraine war, and I watched the Trump and Netanyahu press conference yesterday in horror. I think the beginning may have some similarity to the Ukrainian situation when U.S. is pushing Ukraine to cross the Russian red line, but the ending of it will be remarkably close to the Israeli-Gaza situation, in which Taiwan will have no say, will not be consulted in the final negotiation because we're independent. We're not a part of any international organization. We do not have formal diplomatic relationship with even the United States. So just like Gaza and their governments weren't consulted before the final 21-point or 20-point peace plan, I think if there were a potential peace and stability threat or potential conflict on Taiwan Straits, if it reached a state of two nuclear superpowers decided to either flex their muscles or engage in the final negotiation, unfortunately, I think Taiwan will probably be the last to be informed, and rather than being a party to a balanced final political solution to the Taiwan situation.
Professor Sachs, your response.
Clearly, Taiwan is in a very dangerous situation, and in situations like this, it's always important to recall the words of Henry Kissinger, who famously said that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, to be a friend is fatal. And what Kissinger was saying is that America uses its friends, meaning the United States tells other countries, we're with you, we back you, you can depend on us, until that's not true. And Kissinger was referring to countless cases in which the U.S. Was encouraging other political leaders to engage in wars, so that effectively these were proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the United States and Russia. And at some point, those wars become devastating to the friend country. And at some point, at least so far, the U.S. has chosen an off-ramp, which leaves the so-called friend or ally stranded in the end. Of course, the sympathy towards that stranded country has to be limited, because usually they have naively depended on the United States that they're going to be protected in some kind of confrontation. So the relevance of that observation for Taiwan is very direct and very strong. If any Taiwanese leader believes the United States can truly protect Taiwan from something that crosses the mainland red line in a real red line, forget it. This is absurd to even think so. And that's why I have said over recent years, look at Ukraine. Look at Ukraine. You could also look at Gaza. You could look at Afghanistan. You could look at almost any of these wars of choice that the United States has been engaged in Syria, in Libya. The list is very, very long. The United States engages in wars because it doesn't listen to other parties. It really just barrels through and claims that all objections are signs of weakness or phony propaganda of the other side, or bluffs. And so the U.S. tends to act extraordinarily arrogantly. It tends to take a client or vassal and build them up and tell them, we're with you, you're great, and you're really important for our security, and we're going to back your security, and then things go very badly in the end. And if one is thinking about a confrontation between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, I think there's every reason, sad to say, to think that such a confrontation would be devastating. Devastating for Taiwan first and foremost, but I would put the U.S. second on the list of devastation. It would not win such a confrontation outright. And third, of course, any confrontation between nuclear powers can be devastating for the whole world because things get out of control. And when you lose conventionally, there are always voices on the losing side that say we need to escalate all the way, because if we lose conventionally, we lose everything. We lose our stature, we lose our prestige, we lose our alliance. In this case, if it was the U.S. Losing a military confrontation with China thousands of miles away from the U.S. coast, and that's what the war games suggest it could be quite likely, you'd have voices in the United States saying we cannot afford to lose this, because then we would lose Korea, Japan, the Philippines. We'd lose all our alliances in Asia. We'd be kicked out of Asia. The consequences for the U.S. would be completely devastating. We must escalate. And then one is on a path of potentially global destruction. And so this is why you don't cross red lines of other major powers. My own view is the basic principle is to stay out of each other's lanes. I do not recommend that China put a military base in Mexico. It would not go well. I do not believe that China should militarize anywhere in the American neighborhood. No reason for it. I don't think that China would do it for a moment. They have zero interest in it. And similarly, I've never believed that the United States should have military bases in Ukraine or in the South Caucasus or anywhere around China. And for that reason, this is a basic proposition. I've tried in a recent little essay to distinguish two concepts that I think are completely different. There is the concept in international relations of spheres of influence, which are deemed to be, well, depending on who says it, illegitimate claims of authority by a major power over smaller countries in a region. So maybe this China would have claims of a sphere of influence over Southeast Asia, say, or the United States a sphere of influence over the Americas. But there's a different concept that I think is valid, and that is a sphere of security, which is that I do not believe that, or I do believe that the great powers should rightly say to others, don't come to say to the other great powers, especially the other nuclear powers, don't come to our borders to threaten us, harass us, provoke us, divide us. And this is true in the Western Hemisphere. The United States has long claimed this in the Monroe Doctrine, more than 200 years old, to the European great powers, don't bother us in our own neighborhood. And the United States should respect that in other regions. And that way, I think the major nuclear powers can stay out of each other's way, respect each other's red lines, and we can avoid nuclear war, which I take to be the number one quest of diplomacy in this world, that we don't blow ourselves up and we don't take provocations or accidents or failures to heed red lines and thereby end up on an escalatory path that is completely devastating. So this is my basic point, which is prudence. We're in a world of thousands of nuclear weapons. China has expressed red lines in regard to Taiwan that I think are completely understandable historically, and they are China's red lines, and they should be understood, and they should be respected. Peace should also be respected by China. It should be respected by everybody. But the point is that we should avoid a nuclear confrontation or a confrontation between nuclear power giants.
Dr. Lay, something that you said ties to what Professor Sachs just said is this ignorance or deliberate overlooking on part of the DPP about the fragility of relying on American guarantee for Taiwan's security in the framework of what they propose. I was curious if you could tell us a little bit about how is the ruling elite in Taiwan responding to the overall neo-imperial strategy that the American elites are unfolding across the globe. I'm thinking about South Korea being forced into $350 investment, which it cannot materialize without massive amount of swap lines. It represents something about 70% of its foreign exchange. Even with Taiwan, we are thinking about the TSMC being forced into producing in Arizona, surrendering its intellectual property rights, etc. So under this set of contradictions, we have been seeing a lot of rethinking in places like India, in Brazil. How are the ruling elites who have been hitherto very deliberately chosen blindness about the reality, how are they responding to these kinds of arm twistings?
Well, a lot of things that you mentioned happened post April 2nd this year. Under the guise of trade negotiation, the current DPP government has not only acquiesced, but also assisted, facilitated the move of Taiwan's high-tech industries to the United States. It is not just TSMC and not just the dollar amount. With the other satellite companies and factories that will be moving alongside with TSMC, we are estimating by the most sort of authoritative magazines that we will have about 200,000 talents moving along with these companies. And that accounts started from 85 companies to about 200 companies to TSMC's US site. So if you think TSMC is a silicon shield for Taiwan, think again, because the silicon shield will be moved away from Taiwan and into Arizona and Texas. So that's number one. The number two is, if you look at what happens in the West Pacific, I'll tag on to what Jeff said earlier. U.S. has very strong military installation previously in Japan, in Korea. Recently in Okinawa, the front islands very close to Taiwan, and then in the Philippines. Philippines just gave U.S. 9 additional military bases. So if you look at the Pacific Deterrence Project, the most notable installations will be in the Philippines. Once again, without Taiwan in the middle, they still managed to build a pearl line of the first island chain. All of this will be consistent with the U.S. strategy of peace through strength. And Jeff just said, you have sphere of influence or sphere of security. These are what China has been doing. Just think about RCEP and think about aerial denial and anti-access. One is on sphere of influence. The other is on sphere of security. It's very clearly delineated the area in which PRC is concerned about and is building a military to support its own security concerns. But U.S. is a expansionary military presence in the West Pacific. Most recently, the Virginia-class nuclear submarine is in the Philippines. Previously, more and more sort of missile guiding installations are in Korea. They're moving the nuclear submarines, Virginia-class, to Australia. So in the United States overall game plan, there will be not only conventional weapons, but also nuclear submarines, most lethal weapons, positioned in the West Pacific. So that would constitute a potential for escalation. So let's go back to our history. Taiwan and China officially started and unfinished a civil war. In 1949, October 1st, exactly today, when PRC established its government, then you will have two different governments across Taiwan Straits. One in Taiwan, that's the ROC, the other in China, in mainland China, which is the PRC. Both claims to be the only representation or legal representation of the entire China. So we are still in a civil war, and that hasn't finished. There was no peace agreement at the end of it. There was no one over the other. So technically, we are still at a civil war, but de facto, we are in peace for the last 66 years. The last time any bomb dropped in any land controlled by the ROC, which is Taiwan's government, is 1958, the year I was born. So I will never forget that year. 66 years ago, we had the last bomb dropped in Guimei. But since then, we were de facto at war. We are de facto in peace. That's what I meant. Sorry, misspoken. So we are de facto in peace. And why are we all of a sudden in the last 3 years keep talking about the potential war? Don't forget, Taiwan used to have a very strong military presence by the United States. We have a MAG, which is the military advisory group, training all our armies. And then we have a Air Force base in the central part of Taiwan called CCK. We have a large U.S. naval base in the southern part of Taiwan in Zuoying. So Taiwan had an extremely strong U.S. military presence, and U.S. ally trained and cooperated with us. We have strong joint operability that all ceased all of a sudden at the end of 1978. In fact, 1979, January 1st, Taiwan was no longer a U.S. ally. They severed diplomatic relationship. The Taiwan Defense Treaty ended 6 months later, so we no longer have official defense relationship with the United States. So all of these rhetoric about supporting Taiwan, military presence, which is quite a large number in Taiwan, and Taiwan's troop has been sending to U.S. overseas bases and U.S. Mainland bases for training. So that's, happening in recent years and recent months. But with all of these, they can no longer replace the kind of U.S.-Taiwan or U.S.-ROC joint defense treaty relationships before the 1979 severance of the diplomatic tie. So the DPP government may have an illusion that U.S. is supporting Taiwan militarily, and we are increasing our military budget this year by about $1 trillion NT dollars. But we actually do not have the level of joint operability and the level of support that was our reality that protected Taiwan prior to 1979. There's nothing even close to that. So any illusion of U.S. support of Taiwan, I think is just a very beautiful playbook propagated by the current Washington diplomats as well as State Department personnel and the young and experienced DPP officials just took them all in. They took this bill of goods as a real promise to defend Taiwan.
Professor Sachs, if you could add to this by talking about the information war or narrative war. I am thinking about Noam Chomsky's famous responsibility of intellectuals during the time of the American war on Vietnam. We are living under similar circumstance, and I feel it is all the more important for people in the United States to talk about what it does in the rest of the world. Apart from its military empire, which Dr. Lei has given us an exposition about, if you could tell us about the role of think tanks, media, presence of the National Endowment for Democracy, groups like Voice of America or Radio Free Asia in Taiwan, all of which collectively, or even within the United States, I'm thinking about conservative institutions like Brookings and Hudson's, who should bring elites from Taiwan and frame everything as a narrative between democracy and authoritarianism, which then justifies a war as a justified war. If you could tell about that would be of interest to our viewers.
Well, let me leave the specifics of Taiwan to Joanna, but more generally, the U.S. military-industrial complex has a media military-industrial complex. And this has been true for many decades. The CIA, back in the 50s onward, was very deeply involved in the mainstream media in the United States. It used to be simpler. There used to be a few newspapers and a few broadcasting stations, but the U.S. Government played a major role in the official narrative, and it concocted systematic lies, which, for example, in the case of Vietnam, propagated the war, prolonged the war, and then were revealed by Daniel Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers, which became a famous cause célèbre. And when I was a kid, back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we thought this had been exposed, and that major media like the New York Times or the Washington Post would thereafter be our sentinels of truth in exposing the lies of the military-industrial complex. And of course, I think many people know, but I'll remind people that it was none other than a military leader of the United States, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who became president from 1953 to early 1961, who warned America about the military-industrial complex as undermining American democratic institutions. Well, what he warned us on January 17th, 1961 has come to pass entirely, and the media have become one part of that. It turns out there was no decisive break of the capacity of the U.S. deep state to pervasively dominate the narratives of the mainstream media. In fact, things have gotten worse over time and more insidious. Our mainstream media, if you go one by one, whether it's the digital platforms, for example, say X or Facebook or other digital platforms, or whether it is the major newspapers, the Washington Post, for example, now owned by Jeffrey Bezos, a centibillionaire, or the cable television or the broadcast television. Everything is in the hands of a very small number of people, generally mega billionaires, deeply aligned with the Pentagon, the CIA, the intelligence agencies. So it's amazing to me, living day by day, knowing the things that I do, to watch how the media work. It's what Noam Chomsky indeed told us about for decades. He's, what a absolutely brilliant and pioneering observer of all of this, and he taught us all the arts of careful observation and systematic observation. But for me, it's just shocking to watch the lies and the propagation of ignorance by the New York Times or by the Washington Post or by newspapers I actually once read to try to learn something about what was happening day to day. Now I just read it in amazement, my jaw dropping, saying, how ignorant can you be? Or how can you tell such lies? And by the way, I have a habit, I'm sorry to say, I send emails to the reporters, say, what are you talking about? This is such nonsense. And most of the time they don't respond to me, which I think is a little impolite and annoying. I've been around a bit. They could respond to what I'm saying. We could actually have an adult conversation, but they don't want to have an adult conversation. They have a narrative that they have to, or that they do promote, whether out of ignorance or whether they're seconded by some agency or whether they're paid by these agencies or whether the interests of these billionaires who own all of the media right now. Everyone seems to have to own some media outlet if you're a centibillionaire. So whether you're Musk or whether you're Bezos, or I could give a very long list of these billionaires, they're all entrenched with the military contracting, with the security state, and with the public-facing media. And the interesting thing, by the way, just to end on this, I can't quite figure it out. It works in a strange way. The public does not believe what they hear. So it's not as if the propaganda actually works in the sense of belief, but it dominates the rhetoric. So there is no alternative coherent narrative that is out there. So the public knows that they're being sold a pack of lies, but they don't hear the truth. So it just fills the space, not by convincing people, but by making endless noise and getting people to turn off and turn out from these issues, giving space to the military-industrial complex to do whatever it wants to do.
Dr. Lay, if you could just have a quick response so that we can let Professor Sachs go, and then I'm interested to ask one more question to you.
Okay, well, I think he just described the traditional media theory that's called the spiral of silence. When people think they're in the upper hand, they're getting louder and louder, and they get picked up, get reported, and get recommunicated through many, many channels. However, the other silent majority still exists. They're waiting for people who speak out, just like Jeffrey Sachs have been doing. And therefore, Jeff, what you're doing is extremely important. You're giving the people who have no voice a voice. And by standing there, you give them an opportunity to congregate around you and your cohorts so that that particular point of view, the one advocating peace, will still have a chance. And let me just say one more thing. U.S. continued to be the white knight, at least the self-designated white knight. If you look at the Gaza situation, Trump believes that he is the ultimate white knight and he can determine on the going of whatever happens in the world. However, in the situation of an unfinished civil war across Taiwan Straits, I fully believe that we have the ability and the wisdom and the potential mechanism to resolve our issues across the Taiwan Straits, which happened during the 2008 to 2016 Ma Ying-jeou's regime. And in fact, in November, it will be the 10th anniversary of Ma Ying-jeou's visit with Xi Jinping, and it will be the 20th anniversary of Lian Zhan's visit with Hu Jintao. So people, the top leaders across Taiwan Straits, were able to engage directly across each other. And when KMT was the ruling party holding the regime, then there were from the third rail to the second rail to the first rail, meaning ministry to ministry meetings and negotiations and final agreements. So if the United States can stop playing God or the white knight, I still think that we may have a chance to resolve our issues across Taiwan Straits, to finish the unfinished civil war, and thereby securing peace and stability across Taiwan Straits.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And I agree completely.
Professor Sachs, will let you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be together with both of you. Really, absolutely wonderful. See you again soon.
Dr. Lay, I think we have pretty much covered the theme that I had for today's discussion. I just still wanted to have one response from you based on our previous conversation that we had with you, which was overwhelmingly positive. It reached a large sections of people from across the globe, and we received a lot of emails. Some of them were from people of Taiwan who watch our show and otherwise like our show. And I just wanted to ask you one question that we repeatedly got, particularly from some people of Taiwan, not everyone. And they said that we generally like your show, but in this case, you did not address our concerns, and they mean Taiwan's concerns with the mainland. They spoke, I think if I could remember correctly, they spoke about freedom of religion. They spoke about electoral democracy. Yes, freedom of religion, electoral democracy, and free speech. Of course, we had our own response. We spoke about how the case between Tibet and Taiwan is very different, because in Tibet, it was a case of religion with power, which is not the case in Taiwan. So we don't see any reason why things like freedom of religion can go on under one nation, two systems. We also spoke about Hong Kong, etc. But if you could share your views on that line of criticism that we got from people in Taiwan in particular to our discussion.
Well, obviously, a lot of people are concerned about the way of life in Taiwan. And if there were an eventual unification, will the unique way of life, which is different from mainland China, be preserved? Will we enjoy the kind of freedom that we currently have? There are two responses to that. The one is we currently are losing some of our freedom. If you live in Taiwan and you are open-minded enough, you can see that our freedom as protected by the Constitution has been encroached in many aspects, including freedom of association, which is political participation, and so on and so forth. There is a new party law that allows the DPP government to actually cease operation of over 100 political parties and 40 over political organizations. They're just rescinded their original registration. If we think about freedom of speech and freedom of the press, you can actually observe that space being encroached, starting from CTI's license being rescinded to a lot of direct involvement or direct intervention in the freedom of speech, which is a little bit like the US FCC chairperson directly threatened ABC and Disney on Jimmy Kimmel's show. So, I think freedom of speech everywhere has been encroached, especially by the power that be. But having said that, there are a lot of great and wonderful things in Taiwan that people would love to keep. So if we just examine the 3-4 different places, Hong Kong was returning to China. So all the laws, with the exception of basic law, are exactly identical with what the rest of China has, with the exception of basic law. So it's obviously not a very good example of what, if you want to preserve certain freedom in Taiwan, would be. And if you look at Tibet and other places, they were always a part of China. So you have political dissident, you have religious dissident, and there are struggles and a lot of political comeback on that. I don't profess that know all the details and have all the facts, but I do know that from my direct contact in Tibet and in Xinjiang, their current way of life is a little better than before, actually a lot better than before. So there were some balancing power in those places. But again, it's part of China, even though it's just an autonomous or a minority autonomous region. Now let's take a look at Taiwan's situation. Taiwan, even though in the constitutional sense, it's part of China, but it's not under the PRC government rule. It's not under the Communist Party rule. So I think the better analogy may be the newly formed Hainan district. Hainan, as a free port, has a lot of laws different from the rest of the China, because they are trying to have an open zone, which would give them certain freedom in many different ways. So even though they don't touch the basic foundation of what we talked about, like religious freedom and freedom of speech, but Hainan may be a model that if we were to negotiate a future of unification, then what is the two systems in Taiwan? The Taiwan system can be using certain legal framework to define, rather than having it absorbed into mainland China like Hong Kong and having only one basic law. So while this is still developing and evolving, we are observing what's happening to Hainan with keen interest. Hopefully that will provide another model of how we may preserve what Taiwanese love and cherish of way of life, but also prevent war, and have a larger economic participation, joining in the overall ascendance of Asia, Asia Pacific, Asia, and the rest of global South may have an opportunity, and Taiwan may go through China and participate the entire just mobilization as well as the rising of the global South. And that would be a very exciting future. So once again, we don't have all the future in our hands, but if with wisdom and willingness and the ability to not go into war and destruction, then we can have certain forum discussions to talk about potential solutions of the future. It may just start as a very small mustard seed, but it can grow into a potential blueprint.
Recently, when I was in Beijing, I spoke to a journalist, but who's been very close to some of the party officials. His father was in military, and we discussed about Taiwan and mainland. And one of the things I told him was that an aggressive hawkish policy from the mainland is not a good strategy, because we are talking about the same people, we are talking about the same nation, and the mainland has to, it's a tough thing to do, but it has to somehow make a distinction between its defensive but somewhat hard, increasingly hard policy against American sphere in its backyard, which I think is justified. The mainland is justified to push back against, but not let that axe fall on Taiwan, because we are talking about the same people. But at the in the same way, I tend to talk to people from Taiwan that Taiwan should bargain very hard about its things that it values, the things it wants to preserve. But one of the foremost things to do that is to not indulge in a military war with the mainland at the behest of the Americans. The mainland would be more likely to give more and more concessions as long as they don't come up as riding on the back of the Americans and thinking of a military solution to this long history. Final closing comments on for you, and we'll leave it there.
I'm glad that you mentioned the potential for negotiation. The number 1, 2, 3 of negotiation is if you were to engage in principal negotiation, you must have trust and respect of your opponent across the table. And I think currently the DPP doesn't have the trust and respect from mainland China, so it's very hard to engage in any kind of negotiation, unlike what I said earlier during 2008 and 2016. So to avoid a potential catastrophic future, it is important to have people that can represent Taiwan, but also be respected and trusted by mainland China. And that's number 1. Number 2 is in a principal negotiation, it is important to have your objective clear. For example, we say we want to have Taiwan's way of life maintained. What do we really care about? What do we want to see as having a guarantee? What kind of KPI may there be? What kind of guarantees are we seeking? You cannot just say we want everything in Taiwan to stay as is, which is not going to be an opening position of a negotiation, but you must lay it out, and people in Taiwan must have consensus on laying out what's important for us. I think a lot of this soul searching has been hidden under the really big talk of an independent Taiwan with backstop of the United States and Japan. And most recently, the president even said the Taiwan peace and stability is guaranteed by Abe, who said if Taiwan had something happened, it would happen to Japan. And we all know that it was just talk. But the current president seemed to attribute everything, including the peace, stability, and the status quo of Taiwan Strait, to Abe, and even taken a Japanese position of the end of Second World War, saying it's the ending of the war and not a complete surrender of Japanese military forces. So I think in Taiwan, we have a lot of way and work to do in order to prepare ourselves to a position that mainland China is willing to negotiate with us. But at the same time, mainland China has a lot of different fractions. You have different people. You have a lot of people saying, oh, no, we are so impatient with Taiwan. Let's just go through a military action and we're going to take them back in a day. Such a hawkish talk doesn't help us to move in your direction. That is, we don't kill each other. We don't have bloodshed. We don't have hatred coming from the bloodshed across Taiwan Straits. If we were to respect our history, the only logical position is to end a civil war in a peaceful manner. And ending the civil war certainly requires a lot of wisdom, but a lot of strong leadership.
We'll leave it there, Dr. Lei. This was a fascinating conversation about geopolitics covering Asia Pacific, but we were also glad we were able to bring in some internal dynamics of Taiwan. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹饪。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。